Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is Nativism in the 1920s. And here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. Let's start by reviewing immigration to the US in the early 1900s. The early 1900s were a time of huge immigration. Industry was booming and factory owners needed a lot of workers, so they convinced the government to let just about anyone in. Although there were a couple countries, like China and Japan, that were excluded because of racism. Most of the immigrants at this time came from Southern Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. And unlike the Protestants who had immigrated to the US in earlier decades, many of these newer immigrants were either Catholics, Jews, or Orthodox Christians. Nativism means opposition to immigrants. Although nativism has always been around in the US, it got a lot worse in the 1920s. And in this video, I'm going to explain a few reasons why nativism increased at this time. The main reason was the Red Scare, which was a widespread fear of communism and anarchism in the US in the years after 1917. Anarchism is a radical belief that opposes capitalism, challenges government control, and argues that people should work together without having to be controlled by authority. Both communism and anarchism are opposed to capitalism, which was the economic system of the US. Why did these fears occur after the year 1917? 1917 is a major year in world history. It was the year of the Russian Revolution, in which communists in Russia successfully overthrew the Russian government. Americans who supported capitalism saw what happened in Russia, and they were scared that communists might plot a similar revolution in the US. Both communism and anarchism use red as a symbol. And in America, members of both of these groups have been called Reds. All right, to sum up, communism and anarchism are ideologies that disagree with capitalism. There was a communist revolution in Russia in 1917, and in the years after 1917, many Americans feared that communists and anarchists might take over America. And we refer to those fears as the Red Scare. Although communists and anarchists lacked the power to actually overthrow the US government, there were some events in the US at this time that caused Americans to worry. This man is named Luigi Galliani, and he was an anarchist who had immigrated to America from Italy. Galliani believed in using terrorism to accomplish his goals. And in 1919, Galliani and his followers mailed bombs to 36 government officials. Most of the bombs failed to kill their targets, but they did kill 2 people. A much deadlier act of anarchist terrorism occurred 1 year later, when anarchists detonated a bomb on Wall Street in Lower Manhattan, which is considered the heart of American capitalism. The Wall Street bombing killed 40 people and injured 148 others. The Wall Street bombing and the Gallianist mail bombings both contributed to widespread fears of anarchism in the US. In response to those fears, the US government raided the homes and offices of suspected communists and suspected anarchists, arrested them, and if they were immigrants, deported them back to the countries they had immigrated from. And this response was known as the Palmer Raids. It was named after the US Attorney General at the time, Mitchell Palmer. He's in this photo. The Palmer Raids were controversial because they targeted many people who had committed no crimes, violating their civil rights. So what does this have to do with nativism? Well, many of the people who supported communism and anarchism in the US were poor factory workers. And most of the poor factory workers were immigrants. And although most immigrants in the US did not support communism or anarchism, many Americans began to associate these ideologies with immigrants anyway. Galliani, for example, was an immigrant from Italy. So, a fear of radical ideas turned into a fear of immigrants. Fears of immigrants also led to an important change in immigration law. In 1924, Congress passed a new immigration law that basically stopped immigration to the US. The law was called the Immigration Act of 1924, and it's also known as the National Origins Act. This law set a limit on the total number of immigrants that could come into the US each year from every country in the world, and these limits are called quotas. The thing about this law was that the quotas were different for different countries, and some countries were favored over others. If you look at this chart, which lists the quotas for different countries, you can see that countries in Northern and Western Europe, like England and Germany, got very large quotas. That means a lot of immigrants were allowed to come from those countries. These were countries where people were white and Protestant, like the first immigrants to the US. Eastern and Southern Europe got smaller quotas. And countries in Africa and Asia got extremely low quotas. Because most immigrants at this time had been coming from Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe, the low quotas from those regions caused immigration to drop. And the Immigration Act of 1924 led to a huge decrease in the number of immigrants. During the 1920s, very few people were allowed to enter the US. As nativism increased, the Ku Klux Klan experienced a large revival. The Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, is a terrorist group dedicated to keeping white people in charge, and that is called white supremacy. We last learned about the KKK during the period of Reconstruction. That's when it was formed, and it was then using violence to prevent African Americans in the South from exercising their new rights. Until the 1920s, the KKK was located entirely in the South. But as African Americans left the South during the Great Migration, KKK groups were created in every state in America. Also, the KKK stopped persecuting just African Americans, and they started going after immigrants too, especially immigrants who were Jews or Catholics. This picture shows a KKK rally in Ohio, a northern state. And this picture is an advertisement for a KKK group in Connecticut, which is right next to New York. Finally, nativism in the 1920s was symbolized by the trial of these two men, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists who had immigrated to the US from Italy. In 1920, they were accused of murdering a security guard during a robbery in Massachusetts. They claimed that they were innocent, and the evidence against them was weak. Their case gained national and international attention, with people all around the world protesting for them to be released. But it was to no avail. Sacco and Vanzetti were immigrants, and they were anarchists. And during this climate of nativism and the Red Scare, Americans were quick to assume that they were guilty. Despite the lack of evidence, a jury convicted Sacco and Vanzetti, and both were sentenced to death. In 1927, they were executed by the electric chair. Their execution showed that while the Roaring Twenties may have been a fun party decade, it also had a dark side. All right, it's time to review the objectives. There was a lot in this video, so if you missed anything, rewind it and look again. I will see you in class. Bye, students.